Welcome to Nailing It Down, and today I'm going to do something that I don't normally do here on Nailing It Down and address a longer video on a salient point, one that I have actually changed my mind about. For many years, I thought the category of lumpen proletariat, as read in the polemical writings of Marx and in his letters, was an incoherent category because it didn't describe a class. The list of things in the Brumaire and the kind of seemingly moralistic metaphors used around industrial waste led me to believe that it was Marx struggling with an other to define the proletarian against beneath it. But I have come to believe that this is no longer true. Partly in looking more into the writings from the Second International on the problems of the lumpen proletariat and who has considered it, and partly by realizing that one of the biggest problems that we have is the Marxist insistence on a definition of the working class of which they never actually pin down, so it becomes a rhetorical strategy or something you can divorce from any real sociological or economic category. And what do I mean by that? Well, if you've been around Marxist circles very long, you'll hear people say, well, the working class is not just a sociological category, it's also a political category. Or if they are smarter, they will say, you might be describing the working class in itself, but not for itself. And this is fair enough. After all, the politically conscious class operates in its own interest, whereas a sociological category is an aggregate of individuals who may or may not be operating in the interest of themselves as a class of people. And that's a fair point, and one true and important to classical Marxism. But people have been struggling to deal with the fact that it seems so removed, particularly the productivist descriptions of the working class in Capital's Volume 1. Now, I have read enough Marx to not accuse him of being always consistent. Okay? This is not me trying to vindicate Marx. And in fact, I sat down and came up with a bunch of categories that Marx plays with in Capital's volumes 1, 2, and 3, and in Theories of Surplus Value, and tried to make them more coherent. So you had productive and unproductive. Now, productive and unproductive, if you read Theories of Surplus Value, are productive and unproductive to the surplus of capital, or in putting it in normal people's terms, the production of wealth. Not necessarily the wealth for general society, by the way. This is captured by capitalists. But nonetheless, that wealth and that technological accumulation exists. Then you have the divisions of socially necessary and socially unnecessary. And there are many things that are not productive, but are socially necessary. All right. So logistics is productive and is socially necessary, but isn't productive in a direct way. It enables production to happen. Education is unproductive in generating surplus or in commodities, but is socially necessary for the social reproduction of various functions in society. And let me say that again in normal people terms. If you don't teach people certain skills, they can't do certain things to maintain their way of life. Right? Legal fiat, which is legally necessary, but not socially necessary. So, for example, what David Graeber calls bullshit jobs are often legally necessary because they're required to maintain certain records or legal fiat, but they're not socially necessary. And in fact, they're a net drain. Finance capital. While sometimes it is socially necessary to increase liquidity and capital as a whole, and thus enable other people to be productive, it makes profits off of siphoning off surplus. So it is not socially necessary all the time. It is sometimes. And this is a hard category here. but it isn't productive in the direct sense. And in fact, its profits are siphoning off the general profits in society at large. Now, to say this explains things that happen under this period of capital we like to call neoliberalism may be a little bit too ambitious, but let's think about this for a second. Since the crisis of the 1970s, increasingly profits have been found by finance capital, initial spurs of production through suppression of labor and increased labor efficiency, and which, for those of you who don't understand what that means, that's economic speak for making people work either faster or just more for the same amount of pay. All right. That's what labor efficiency means. So we have a couple of phenomenon there. But then we start really looking at things. Where has the production gone? Now, sure, you have, everybody has a narrative of deindustrialization in the developed world. Of course, it is most acute in the United States, and then in Western Europe. But deindustrialization and the industrial worker were never the predominant force in society in terms of real numbers. And we need to come back to that, because this is where the conflicts around revisionism, the first time, emerged. Revisionism began when Bernstein started looking at the fact that in general society, they couldn't find evidence that the industrial labor ever became the majority of the population, even though the population was increasingly proletarianized. In the writings of the Second International, then, you start seeing an increasing concern for the lumpen. Now, again, I thought this was a moralistic mirror of the working class. But two things happened. I started thinking about this whole fascination with the precariat that we saw about 10 years ago, right after Occupy. And then recently, the work of Dr. Clive Barrow, which I read under the advice of Daniel Tutt, had me really rethinking what lumpenization meant beyond what was stated in the Brumaire and the manifesto. Because what you started seeing was concern by Marx of the elderly who are no longer employable and those systemically outside of employment. And what Clive Barrow points out is it might be better to think of this as a social category that comes from a process of efficiency and capital, and not a class. Now, this relates to some other things, and I'll get to this when we talk about the professional managerial class thesis and why I've had issues with it, because it does tie together and explains a lot of things to me. To get back to this, though, I don't mean lumpen as a class. Professor Burrow calls it a social category, like the way we might talk of race or gender or sex, meaning it has a meaningful and material basis that is related to what we call as classes. And remember, classes are different. Classes under capitalism are different than classes in the past, because classes in the past were legally prescribed. And in a way, classes now are legally prescribed, but in a way that is obscured by the way we do employment. Whereas if you were a serf, it was a social and legal construction of which you were bound and maintained by force. Direct force, not just a force of starvation. And classes historically have generally worked like this. They are prescribed by religious or civil authorities, and they are maintained by force. Classes in the capital, and this is an innovation of Marxism in its theoretical analytic, are not maintained by direct force. In fact, free labor becomes an important category. And the productive nature of the proletariat is also part of its function. So the proletariat is technically free, even though it's compelled to work because it doesn't own its own means of production. But it produces things that enable society to move. Now, this brings us to the changing nature of labor and why lumpenization has increased. What Clive Burrow points out is in the late works of Marx and Engels, particularly in their unpublished letters that you can find in the collected work of Marx and Engels, the MECW, or the MAGA, which hasn't been fully translated into English, the MAGA 2, which is MEGA 2, you will start to notice that they talk about the lumpen, properly speaking, and the honest lumpen. And the honest lumpen are seasonal and precarious social workers in our common language. So then I started looking up statistics. Now, I've talked about this obsession with the PMC with the industrial working class. And then when you push people on that, they shift it to mean blue collar working class. But blue collar working class and the industrial productive working class are not and have never been the same thing. They have different interests. Just like managers and professionals also have different interests, which is why the PMC thesis, as expounded by Ehrenreich, which ties it primarily to education, I found to be an outdated relic of the 1970s that has been resurrected largely for rhetorical purposes by people who are of the class, in quotation marks, they are describing. The PMC recognizes the PMC, and as a social category, if we're going to talk about that like we do with the lumpen, it makes some sense. But if you look at the interest of the different groups included in that, including all educated people entirely, it starts to fall apart as an incoherent category. Academics do not have the same material incentives as private sector professional managers. Neither have the same incentives as professionals who are largely rentiers. Furthermore, tech rentiers and other petit bourgeois are a separate category still together, while they're often lumped in with the professional managerial class because of their political allegiance to, say, liberalism and their tendency to rent seek. Now, what does lumpenization help us understand? And this is where things may become controversial, but I'm going to try to lay them out with key facts. Most blue-collar working class jobs, which we colloquially refer to as working class in America, are not productive. They are not manufacturing a commodity. They are not even in the logistics of commodity. According to the Bureau of Labor Statistics, 80% of employment in all sectors is in service providing sectors of the economy, both public and private. That includes utilities, wholesale trade, retail trade, which is almost 10% of the economy. I'll get to that in a minute because that's huge. Transportation and warehousing, information services, financial activities, professional and business services, educational services, healthcare and social services, leisure and hospitality, federal government, and state and local government. Now, that's a huge sector. That is 80% of the economy. Goods producing services, our goods producing sector, which would be our classical blue collar jobs that are not petit bourgeois, are mining, construction, and manufacturing. They are only 12.5% of all employment in the United States in 2010, 13% in 2020. So there has been a slight uptick, but if we look at where the uptick is, even that is interesting. So if we look at the precise areas, you see mining as 0.5% going down to 0.4% in the United States. That is a heavily lucrative sector that is paid quite a bit. In general, as long as their average income is pretty high. Construction, which was 3.9% in 2010, but had seen a dip because of the housing market crash in 2007, 2008, 2009, and is back up to 4.7%. But that's only really an increase of not even a full percentage. And then manufacturing, which is 8.1%, will drop 0.2% by 2020. And it's projected to drop another 0.5% by 2030, according to the Bureau of Labor Statistics. And I'll provide this for you in the show notes. So if we look at the historical data saying the industrial working class was never more than 44%, that was probably in Bernstein, and look at it now and see that it is literally less than 13% of the population, and is seen to decline in the near future. Well, you might go, well, okay, so why are we focusing so much on this working class? Well, you don't want to know what you mean by it. When the honest lumpen were mentioned by Ingalls, they were referring to people who were in communities that would increasingly have to result on gray and black markets and other extractive capacities, meaning criminal activities to directly exploit other people, such as theft. You can talk about victimless crimes here. Maybe you want to exclude those, and Marx and Engels didn't. But having to work side hustles that are increasingly in the gray market, etc. What we now might call the precariat is an increasingly large part of the population. Eldridge Cleaver pointed this out amongst Black people and predicted it would spread to the entire population of the United States in the 70s and 80s. And my friends, he was right. When we refer to working class, we don't think in America and in most places, if we are being honest, of mining, construction, and manufacturing. We think of transportation and warehousing. We think of service industries. All right. Then we think of the PMC as professional services, healthcare and sales assistance, tech development, etc. But again, none of this actually explains what is going on. So what Clive Barrow pointed out to me is lumpenization is the increasing removal of more and more of the population from stable income, productive and socially necessary activity, and importantly, has to rely on more and more informal economic networks, giving them incentives outside of what is traditionally considered the incentive of traditional working class. The increased focus on not defining the working class as anything other than wage earners, or looking at the role assigned to it and implied strongly in Capital Volume 1, leads us to not understand the modern economy. And even pulling from people like Ehrenreich in their discussion of the early credentialization of the economy in the 1960s and 70s, after the GI Bill really hit, leads you to look at an economy that is no longer the one we are talking about. The resurrection of the PMC explains some of the social functions in this 80% of the population, the service sector, the ones that are educated and have power over other people. But what you will notice is the relation here is a relation not to production. Is a relation to either social reproduction or a relation to being excluded from meaningful production and to the services and things that cannot be removed. Now, Endnotes, chastises lumpen as a moral category if you read Endnotes Volume 4. But they talk about this as why the services have not been the area that were first not outsourced to the developing world and then are not totally automated because they're not totally automatable. And you see this also in the agricultural sector. By the way, let's talk about the agricultural sector. The agricultural sector was the beginning of our understanding of the proletariat because the first sector of the economy to be capitalized in England and in the Italian city-states was agriculture. And that was moving from a serf model to trading on free labor and the enclosure of the commons. And again, of course, the state had to enclose the commons and also establish markets, be it a city-state or the state of England, for this to happen. So it didn't happen naturally, but it did happen. All right. So I want you to hear this. Well, how much of the population is in agriculture and forestry? Well, it's been pretty stable. So it was 0.5%, 1.5%, excuse me, of the U.S. population in 2010. It's 1.5% now. It's predicted to go down 1.4% by 2030. It is a sector that is about 3/4 self-employed or 2/3 self-employed, depending on the statistics you look at. And then you look at the true petit bourgeois, which are people who are self-employed small business owners, and you are looking at 5.5% of the population, and it's predicted to decline to 5.1% of the population. I want you to think about what that means. Lumpenization is not a class. The lumpen class isn't a thing, just like the PMC aren't a class. They are a social category of which you can understand certain kinds of relations. But if you look at their incentives, they're divided and uneven even amongst themselves in both cases. All right. It's lumpenization is different from the PMC in that is a non-relationship to production, where the PMC is a privileged relationship to the management of services and goods. I used to call it the PM strata, although partly despite Ehrenreich, because she specifically talks about this not being useful, but also because it points out that there's multiple groups of people who do not have the same interest falling into the category. If you want to use it, PMC, fine, but know that you're using something that people do not have a concrete definition of, just like they don't have a concrete definition of working class. And I want people to think about this when they think about the frustrations of trying to traditionally unionize these areas. Yes, you can unionize franchises. Yes, you can unionize individual shops in a non-franchise thing like Starbucks. But the efficacy of that beyond negotiating better contract conditions is pretty low. This is why we've seen increased focus on things like tenants unions, where there's slightly more efficacy because the industrial model has so severely declined. Now, I'm not just telling you this to crush your Marxist dreams. And no, my friends, this is not solely a development of the West either. Similar traditions have been observed in China, and I'll link a paper that talks about this. Now, this is a conventional economic paper, but one that is important. The CICC, the China International Capital Corporation Limited, shows that employment in broad manufacturing shrank by 23 million people between 2015 and 2017, a decline of almost 8 million people a year. But this has not been a contraction in general employment, and it was not caused by the trade war, as is often cited, which really began in 2008. It appears that the Chinese economy has improved labor productivity, i.e., more technology and automation, and the slowing growth of broad manufacturing and the expanse of high-skilled services, just like the Western economy. Meaning, the same trends are there. There's been a bigger attempt to decrease lumpenization in China, which was why there was, why there were things like the internal limits on, limits on internal migration in China. And this was to keep the development of similar styles proletariat in the city from happening, but it still seems to be following similar trends. Indeed, worldwide, what David Graeber calls bullshit jobs is actually something more pernicious. It is not just a professional managerial class creating work for itself. And in fact, those lead to a very ideologically constructive view of how society works. I don't think that's how society works. That implies there's a conspiracy of people to create bullshit jobs who have bullshit jobs, and that just isn't the case. And the effects of this are pernicious. Why would you have loyalty or self-discipline when it will not be rewarded? You need cunning for the hustle, of side gigs. But increasingly, loyalty to anything other than blood family will not be rewarded. Now, this has strong effects on things like unionization. One reason why the attempt to unionize new workers is often scattered by unions themselves is, and I've heard this from the teachers' union representatives explicitly, is that people won't stay in the field long enough for the union membership to be meaningful. And people know this. Now, this puts the union membership in a death spiral, and it's reflected in the numbers even now. Currently existing unions are not growing. New unions are growing, but the overall unionization fell. You only saw a small uptick between, and I mean like a half of a percent between 2014 and 2019, which was largely undone during COVID. The unionization efforts you see celebrated now are vital and important, but they are actually not the normal trend, despite what Jacobin magazine will try to tell you. Why is this? Well, it's reflected in the numbers I'm talking about. The kinds of things we are talking about are resistant to both traditional guild unions, which are very traditional unions, which, pre-19th century, and industrial unions. Only broad-scale social unionizing that included unemployed workers could deal with this. But there has been no clear answer of how to deal with lumpen and semi-lumpenized people. As Clive Burrows shows, Lenin and Mao tried to push them in the army and had trouble disciplining them because while they were often the most radical, they were easily bought off or would lose incentive. Marx talks about this as well. Mao then tried to re-educate them and teach them to be workers with mixed success, depending on the kind of lumpen you were talking about. He had schools for the non-hostile classes. These schools, by the way, are where the myth of brainwashing comes from. But this, again, was only partially successful. Rosa Luxemburg's answer to it was to increase the welfare state to tie these increasingly semi-lumpenized people into the broader interest of the working class productivity. But that hadn't seemed to work. As the Black Panthers were often afraid of, the removal of these mutual aid things, mutual aid and self-organizing programs that they did themselves, such as moving the student lunch program from the community as encouraged by the Panthers into the schools per se, is often a way to weaken their self-organizing capacity and further de-skill people who are not particularly skilled. You have a different thing with professionals, managers, and highly credentialed workers. What we see with them is increased specialization. So you actually have hyperskilling in one area and general de-skilling across the board. Now, this is something that people like Joseph Tainter talk about as a natural result of over-complexity in a society and over-specialization. It also eventually, when you add such specialization with highly bureaucratized, highly administrative universities, leads to general cowardice, frankly, and an unwillingness to speak outside of one's field. And when one does speak outside of one's field, usually it's the people incentivized to do that are the most cranky, meaning that they are most likely to be speaking out of high ideological motivation because they are already bucking social norms. Now, lumpenization should not be taken as a moral category or process. If you prefer the more modern nomenclature of precaritization, fine. It sounds nicer, but you have to still recognize the implications of the situation. Without discipline, and believe me, discipline across the board has declined, most bohemian lifestyles are destructive to the working class, not because they're inherently destructive. They just affect people differently. Right? You can think about this in terms of addiction. People who are highly integrated into communities where they have incentives to be productive members rarely fall into severe addiction. There's study after study on this. I believe the work of Alexander Scott, I think his name, really covers this. I'll find a link about that and include that in the show notes. But without the strong discipline and social, and something driving you to what you do and what you can engage with other people in a meaningful way and produce something in which you care about, addiction becomes not only more prevalent, but the substances and behaviors that lead to addiction become more likely. All right. And eventually, even trying to provide that community becomes impossible. These are compoundingly maladaptive. Now, I say this because I want to remove the blame from some of these things, but I want you to look at the effects realistically. A lot of the way we talk on the left, it's a positive working class or some identity group as a moral victim to whom that we can help and able to overcome for means of justice. I think this is a fundamental error. And I think a lot of it is because people do not want to reconcile with the meaning of the changed economy, because it means that to produce the kinds of behaviors that we want will take more conscious planning. It will take things that must buck societal trends. We must not just encourage discipline to give people something to be disciplined for. Right now, we do neither. Employment becomes a relationship of dependence, of which one does not even learn a skill for which one can be productive in this kind of society. Employment is always alienating, particularly when your product of your labor is removed from you. But this, you don't even have a product of your labor. You are so removed from that it's not even funny. And this is not just a result of the industrialization or moving stuff abroad. Like I said, it's a result of labor efficiency and the result of the domination of finance capital and profiteering. And this is where I switch things on their head. Rentiers, where a lot of people who say there is no declining rates of profit, rentierism is where the profits are, not in production. If you look at raw commodities, while there's been a brief uptick in profits there lately, kind of related to supply chain issues, and they're beginning to be dissolved in inflation, real profitability is in goods and services and things where you can capture your market. And there's no tendency of the rate of profit to decline in such things. But those rentier economies are based on a highly productive economy to undergird them. They're not possible in places without it. Even modern monetary theorists who seem to talk about the remove productive capacity to relationships of a balance sheet of the movement of currency will tell you that the productive capacity and the wealth in a society, so it's the ability to the natural resources to make stuff and the ability to command the making of stuff, really decides how profitable a society can be, not the amount of currency in circulation. Right? Like MMTers are not stupid in the way they're often caricatured. But we have to deal with the fact even white-collar work increasingly seems to take on a lumpenized character. And maybe this leads to the increased frustration around the PMC and the fact that so many people are alienated from not just their job, but the ability to do anything. You don't see life goals set the same way amongst younger people. People have commented on this. You see less people not just marrying, which you might see as, some people might see as a decline of an oppressive institution, but also even partnering, which is a different thing entirely. Increasingly, even service sector work and corporate work, and definitely government work, is in bureaucratized sectors. And the bureaucracy is not about efficiency. It is either to enable better rent seeking or as protection against lawsuit or unaccountability in other areas. This exists because of the accumulation of law and the overcomplexity of technology, but it's subject to highly diminishing returns in efficacy. And let me put that in normal people speak here. It's not as effective over time, period. End of discussion. To get over this, you're going to have to start building meaningful social alternatives and not just encouraging rioting. What makes this, with all this cheap entertainment and ability to turn your brain off, more meaningful? You can't organize with it. We've proven that. Why? Because the decentralized nature of it has already ended because of corporations, not even governments. I know Marxists like centralization because they have a early 19th century understanding of efficiency in general, and very little understanding of brittleness in design. But I've already covered that. Everybody has a cell phone because it's a cheap means of technology to get you a lot of what you need, even though it's also based on rents, and increasingly even the commodity itself is based on rent payments because the actual machine is super expensive. If we change this, we must build social systems to encourage pro-social traits, and including traits that we often downplay on the left, like self-discipline, pro-social behavior, discouraging victimhood. All right. We have to give people something meaningfully to do with their lives and time. Making them dependents of an ever-enlarging state is unlikely to fix that. I'm sorry, social democrats. And hoping that the industrial proletariat is going to rise up when the industrial proletariat is a small subsection of the population is frankly ridiculous. To go over this, we're going to need leadership. And I don't mean leadership as in appointing leaders or parties to lead us through the way, because the people who want to make these parties are also subject to the same conditions that we're talking about. Many cannot hold down gainful employment, or if they do it slowly off of producing media products like I am right here, which themselves may be enriching as education or entertainment, but are not generally productive to the social movement in which they meet, or even to producing a political line in which people can hold themselves. And most talk of political lines are imposed by people who do not understand the situation. No, we don't need to increase social conformity or tail the left, or the left Democrats or the right Republicans are to seek redress from victimhood. After all, those who are in power do not ask their oppressors to be nicer to them. No, we need to start designing a world that takes this lumpenization and the decrease in the winning, actually, of a competition between non-productive elements of capital and the productive elements of capital into real consideration. And most of what I see in the socialist left is trying to pretend that we're in the 1930s and that things went wrong in the 1970s and we're still even in that economy. None of that is true. Stop just reading theory and start looking at statistics with the theory in mind. Stop using categories to get out of your situation or to compete with your social rivals or to weaponize them because you think the professional managerial class, of which you belong, by the way, most of you who use this term, is just degenerate. And start looking at the way inter-elite competition and the overcomplexity of society has engineered these things and what you could do to make this more meaningful. Because until you address those questions, your politics aren't meaningful. And they aren't meaningful, by the way. You've noticed that throughout this entire left-wing resurgence worldwide, it doesn't really have much of a say on the planet. And that's because it's not looking at essential facts on the ground. It's vitally important you know these categories down, because it's vitally important you know what you're actually advocating. Yes, lumpen proletariat is not a coherent class, but no one ever said it was a class. And when I realize that, it changes my position. If people stop insisting that the PMC is a class and start talking about the incentives that align educated people in a real way, and the real distinction between urban and rural in the United States, and the fact that the petit bourgeois 6%, in America, have a lot of say in politics because they are often the only effective economies in the increasingly deracinated center of the country, then maybe you'll have a meaningful politics. And you don't get that by culturally tailing the right or trying to make some deal with the Democrats. You deal with that by coming up with answers to the real questions on the ground, giving people incentives to be disciplined, giving the incentives to develop the right kind of leadership. There are leaders now. They're just not incented to be productive to us. And until you do that, you cannot nail any political thing down. Over and out.